Yeah, it's a pleasure to introduce Professor Marcus Hamilton. He's a professor of data analytics in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Texas in San Antonio. I read that he is originally British, and he received his PhD in 2008 from University of Mexico. And he's actually very broadly oriented in terms of ecology, statistical physics, evolutionary anthropology, but also with techniques of and methodology of complex system science, and that makes it very interesting for us. It's also a topic which interests us a lot, but is not often we discuss this kind of topic. So it's very nice, I think, to hear about this. I also read that he got the President's Distinguished Research Award in 2020. So that's last year. So congratulations with that.
Like de deur dicht doen, Martine.
And well, we're looking very much forward to your talk. Go ahead.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for the invite. It's great to be here today. So I'm very, I love Centers for Complex Systems, right? I spent many years at the Center for Complex Systems at Sanofi Institute in New Mexico. And I've been taking a complex systems approach, however that's defined, right, to anthropological and social science systems since grad school for 20 years, 20 plus years now. So it's something I'm very passionate about, and sort of trying to integrate anthropology into this sort of way of thinking about things. So today I'm going to be talking about a fundamental issue in anthropology, which is surprisingly poorly understood. In fact, it's not just anthropology, it's across the social sciences in general. And that is the relationship between the scale of a social system, so measured as the number of people, the network structure of that system, or the geographic dispersal of that system, and the complexity of that system, and the complexity being the political structure, the economy, the organization of that system. And so anthropologists have always been interested in understanding how the complexity of social systems changes as the scale changes, as the size changes, but understanding actually what goes on in those kind of transitions is unclear. And there's been lots of speculations and lots of theories about this. And so myself and my colleagues for a number of years, in terms of this overall interest in human ecology and how human ecology itself is diversified over time and space, over human evolutionary history, one of the key structures of that is the social networks we form, because most of our ecology is mediated through the social structures we form. So what's particularly interesting here anthropologically, if we think about this in a larger sense, compared to the biological world in general, is the enormous diversity of human social systems. There are many different viable ways of being a functional human, right? Most of us today live in industrialized, market-based economies. At least all of us here do, but there are many people on the planet that live subsistence-based, small-scale existences, and everything in between. So part of the whole interest here is understanding how that diversity evolved, and the larger understanding is why humans have such extraordinary intraspecific diversity that you don't see in zebra populations or prairie dog populations or any other kind of mammal. Okay, so we're going to be talking about sociopolitical complexity in traditional human societies. When I'm talking about traditional human societies, generally we're trying to limit it to human societies that have limited interaction with market economies, with industrialized economies. Whether or not that's actually strictly true is another question, right? So to me, it all starts off with computation. So the social structures that humans form is all to do with computation and inference, right? It's all the fact that we've evolved large brains with 86 billion neurons and hundreds of trillions of connections within those neurons. And then we create these fantastical, worlds in our heads that we can use to make all kinds of inferences about the world around us. So we're capable of doing these extraordinary computations, which allow us to interact with the environment in very sophisticated ways, planning ahead, thinking behind, negotiating where we are, abstracting ourselves, being able to think about ourselves objectively, which we don't think other mammals are able to do, that kind of thing. So that's an extraordinary individual level phenomenon in humans, which seems to be unique to humans. Most of the ability of computation in traditional societies is in the aid of gaining metabolism, right? It's going out, it's being able to forage on a landscape, it's being able to predict where rare resources and high economic returns are located, then working out effective strategies of how to hack the system, right? How to find those things as quickly and easily as possible. And so you're combining computation with metabolism. And of course, any computation requires energy, requires metabolism. So they are two sides of the same coin. And so human social systems, even in small scale systems, are about balancing this trade-off of computation, inference, and metabolism, how you fund that. But the real human success story is this, right? It's collective computation. It's not just individual intelligence, it's plugging individual brains together and the value added benefit you get from doing so. So these are the Hadza, these are Hadza hunters, a photograph taken by a colleague of mine at UCLA just a couple of years ago. Each of these individuals are incredibly skilled hunters. They've been doing this all their lives. But data shows time and time again, if you do this in all different groups, that these guys working together will achieve higher return rates in the long run than they would if they were working alone. So there's some value added benefit that skilled individuals get from plugging themselves into networks of other brains that allow you to achieve end results. And these are generally economies of scale. There are savings in time, there are savings in energy you get. So it's not necessarily that these guys are going to be hunting 5 times the amount of animals because there's 5 of them, or that the animals they're going to get are 5 times bigger. They will have other dependents too, right? It just means that their success rate on average is going to be higher. So over the long term, their long-term return rates get increased. And that's how hunter-gatherer systems work. That's why they live in small groups and cooperate with each other. So of course, most of us now live in these kind of situations. We're an urban species and have been officially for 10, 15 years or so. This happens to be New York, but it could be San Antonio, it could be Utrecht, it could be Berlin, it could be London, right? So the remarkable thing here is, we now live in these mega dense, very nucleated spots on the landscape we call cities. Cities have a long history of stretching back several thousands of years, but they haven't achieved the level, the magnitude until extremely recently, and that magnitude now is growing every day, right? But the extraordinary thing anthropologically here is, the transition from hunter-gatherer to urban dweller, is not a genetic transition. It's not a biochemical transition. It's just a behavioral transition. So the same species can exhibit the same phenotype, the same phenomena, which is extraordinary. And in fact, nowadays, of course, you can go and study hunter-gatherers in the morning, get in a car and be in a center like this, in a few hours. So no longer is this separated in time by thousands of years of evolution, right? This is separated in space by a few hours of travel. So this is an extraordinary circumstance, we modern humans find ourselves in. And of course, nowadays, collective computations occur even beyond Earth boundaries. They occur in space. There's collective computation going on here. It's very managed. In this case, obviously, there's a lot of infrastructure behind this. The only reason this is occurring is not because those two are really smart individuals, right? They are, but they belong to a very sophisticated social network that has invested a lot of time and energy to allow this kind of thing to happen. So this is a function of social networks. So the diversity of what sometimes are called now social reactors, or Louis Bettencourt, who's one of the founders of sort of scaling theory in urban systems, likes to think about cities as urban reactors. So Cities are aggregators of individuals, and the benefits or the output you get from cities are not necessarily the number of individuals. It's all about the interaction of those individuals, which goes up superlinearly with the number of individuals. That's the whole point. So humans now, we have this vast array of social reactors, all the way from what we can think of, you know, as relatively simple social organizations, all the way up to interacting with rovers that we landed on Mars, right? All these interactions, absolutely extraordinary, and no other species have done this. The human species hasn't done this quite literally till a few weeks ago. So the question underlying this is what are the network structures that facilitate these kind of things to happen, and how far back can we trace them? So are urban complex networks, you know, recent phenomena, or do they have a deep evolutionary history in the human species themselves? And yes, that's the story I'm going to tell you, that human social networks have a form, and then we've just been building on that form ever since, right? So we're going to divide this talk, or the rest of this talk, into two sections. I'm going to talk about foraging societies or hunter-gatherer societies and the social organization of hunter-gatherer societies and the quantification of that, and then non-foraging societies, which are essentially farming societies, horticultural societies, pastoralist societies. Foraging societies in anthropology are very important because you know, the foraging lifestyle, the hunter-gatherer lifestyle extends way beyond the human species. Right? We've been on this planet for something on the order of 300,000 years. The foraging lifestyle of hominids probably started at least 2 million years ago with Homo erectus populations. So we inherited this lifestyle and modified this lifestyle, and up until only 10,000 years ago at the most, all humans that have ever existed were hunter-gatherers. When agriculture first appeared on the planet in the ancient Near East 12,000 years ago, it was at that point, by definition, vanishingly rare, right? And then it took thousands of years to spread. So what that means is hunting and gathering was a socio-economic and socio-ecological framework of human biological evolution for the vast majority of our evolutionary history. So understanding the social structures in hunter-gatherer systems gives us a very good insight into how you organize yourself if you are a primate of our body size tasked with foraging the landscape, right? So luckily we have data, pretty good data, on a few hundred hunter-gatherer groups that are known ethno-historically. And so ethno-historically simply means anthropologists, and before that sort of explorers, came across hunter-gatherer populations, recorded meaningful data and information, which have now been aggregated into databases. And this stretches back sort of from starting sort of in the 19th century, the mid-19th century. Most of it was collected, you know, over the 20th century, and it is still being collected today, but there's only a few hunter-gatherer populations that exist on the planet today, but they're all heavily studied by anthropologists, right? So there is a reasonable sample size for us to start making inferences, to start looking at commonalities and patterns in ecology and social structure. So first of all, hunter-gatherer systems, social systems, are complex systems in all forms of the word. So that is, if you're a hunter-gatherer, you will have a family. You'll either be a dependent in a family or you will have your own family, right? You will be existing on a day-to-day basis with multiple other families, because you will not be able to hunt and gather effectively as an individual family unit. So you need others in order to do that. And you do that by creating informal but binding social contracts through things like reciprocal altruism with other families, with sharing resources, pooling resources. And this is the way hunter-gatherers all over the world work, right? So you'll operate in small groups that are politically autonomous. They can do whatever they want. The families are autonomous. They can do whatever they want. And so people travel from band to band. Entire families may just get up and decide to move to another band. Bands may decide to aggregate at some parts of the year and then disperse in other parts of the year, etc. And then at a larger scale, every now and again, multiple bands will get together to form ceremonies, puberty rites, for example, very important things, or mass communal hunting events or collecting events, etc. So what this does is it creates this very complex fission fusion dynamic at lots of different scales of hunter-gatherer systems. So, you know, this sort of classic idea of individual hunter-gatherers or families making a living on a landscape is not true. It's this heavily networked social system, which we're starting to get more and more insight into. So if you look at the data we have available, and then you actually look at the group sizes of hunter-gatherers at these different scales of this social network. So if you look at the size of families and the size of bands, which are composed of several different families, and then the size of larger bands that aggregate every now and again, all the way up to the total, what we call metapopulation, which is a population of independent subpopulations, all of whom interact, you find this modular structure. So here on the y-axis, you have a measure of group size and it's logged. So this is log linear. On the x-axis, these are discrete categories of this social network. So what's intriguing about this is a paper I published actually in grad school, 2007, is showing that in hunter-gatherer social networks, you have this, this sort of geometric series, of social groups. So as you increase in, so go up the tier in social organization, there's a constant branching ratio. So 4 families are generally found in a band, 4 bands form a larger local band, 4 of those, et cetera, all the way up to a larger population. So it has this statistically self-similar property, right? It's limited, there's only 5 scales here, it isn't infinite, right? But it definitely has this signature. The interesting thing is then if you take those hunter-gatherer populations and then you break them out by different environments, it is reasonable to think, you know, hunter-gatherers in different environments are going to have different social organizations. In fact, that's exactly what doesn't happen. In different environments around the planet, if you're on the Arctic or if you're in the tropic or in the desert, you have the same social organization. You camp in the same, with the same number of families, you're integrated in the same size of social network, and even the entire meta population, which is only about 1,000 or so individuals, that doesn't even vary very much. So the size of social organization you're in is independent of your environment, which is really interesting because you might think, the richer the ecology, the more resources, maybe, and the higher population densities, maybe that would change my social structure. No, hunter-gatherers have this franchise structure, which they just then modulate in different environments. And this ends up being part of the success story of how the human species left the African continent and colonized the rest of the terrestrial planet in about 30,000 years, which is the blink of an evolutionary eye, right? By doing exactly this, just franchising the same process, taking the blueprint and just adapting it to your local landscapes. So topologically, this is an idealized form of what that shows. It's this modular hierarchical social system. It has this tetrahedral property, these simplexes, these locally fully connected modular units, which are connected by sparse interactions with the global properties. But this creates small world properties, right, where you have dense local connections and sparser but very important global connections with a wider community. And in hunter-gatherer populations, why this is so important is that you're sharing resources and information on a daily basis with a fixed number of people. You're optimizing your returns, but you're maintaining social interactions with your neighbors and many different kinds of neighbors just by going through a relatively few links. So you're exchanging cultural information, technological information, genetic information, right? There are marriage, this is how marriage structures are mediated, etc. So you create these very complex, hierarchical, statistically self-similar social networks, right? And the ecological properties of the large scale of this are very interesting. This leads to economies of scale in these social networks. So that is, you can then ask the question, if I take these social networks and then I embed them in space, what I observe is that as these social networks get larger, if I control for everything else, the space that they use actually increases at a slower rate. So on a per capita basis, if you're embedded in a larger social network as a hunter-gatherer, you're more efficient at using the space available to you. So there are economies of scale. And this is what humans specialize in, right? This is why we cooperate, and this is why we talk to each other on Zoom, etc., because there are benefits by doing things collaboratively rather than doing everything individually. And so we can mathematize this, and we can understand this from some relatively basic, straightforward ecological principles. So, okay, now let's talk about what happens in non-foraging societies. And this is more recent work, where colleagues and I have been asking the question, well, do you see the same kind of regularities and principles in non-foraging societies? Because in non-foraging societies, now you're dealing with very different sets of circumstances. Now people have very different kinds of subsistence bases. They're doing different kinds of agriculture, different kinds of technologies, different kinds of political systems, all kinds of things, right? So this is a paper in PLOS One. It was just last year, I think. We think it's quite interesting. So, okay, what we have is a database of over 1,000 ethno-linguistic groups worldwide. So these are defined in the same way that the hunter-gatherer groups are defined. These are basically localized meta-populations that are spatially distinct from each other, and they would recognize each other as such. So everybody in that group would recognize each other as belonging to that group, even if they didn't know them individually, and they would be able to recognize somebody else from a different culture as not belonging to that culture, right? So that's kind of how that's defined ethno-linguistically. And then in this database, each of these populations are coded at a different level of socio-political complexity, from total local autonomy to sort of state level societies. And we'll just talk about that briefly. So statistically, we talk about this in terms of what's called the Horton Orders, right? So at the first level, tier 1 is all authority is entirely local. So you can think about hunter-gatherers here. There's no political autonomy above the family unit, or maybe above the local band unit. So nobody's telling you what to do. It doesn't mean there's asymmetries in power, right? Because it just means any authority you've accrued over your life, but you don't pass that down to your offspring. That's when asymmetries start becoming institutionalized, right? So everything is local, everybody's making their own decisions. All the properties of these systems are truly emergent because nobody is governing the overall dynamics of these systems, right? Above that, there's one additional tier of authority over that local group at the second level, right? This means there's some kind of local elite or local chief that's making some sets of decisions for individuals, which are constraining individual behavior. And then we can just keep aggregating layers, right? Then there's a third tier, and then there's a fourth tier, and there's a fifth tier. And by the time you get to a fifth tier, you get to what we would all recognize as some kind of state level society with a bureaucracy, established elites, a royal family, a religious system, etc., right? So we can just visualize this quite simply as thinking, well, 5 tiers isn't actually very much, but if you actually, you think about it, it is. Things get very complex very quickly. So on the upper left here, you have local autonomous groups. At the second level, you have one level of aggregation, the third level, etc. So by the time you get to the fifth level of aggregation, you start seeing a very complex hierarchical network of interactions, right? So it is interesting to note that, complex industrialized nation states like the United States have 5 recognized levels of governmental structure, starting from the city all the way up to the federal government, right? So 5 tiers of hierarchy are plenty for organizing very complex geographically dispersed human societies. So then we just look at the statistical distributions of different properties of these systems. So I'm going to be looking at sort of population size at these different tiers, these different levels of sociopolitical organization, their geographic extent or their geographic range or their area, and then just the division of the two, right? Population density, which is just population size divided by their geographic extent. And they, you know, they show these sort of regular-ish distributions, nothing too shocking. But the results of these are kind of interesting. So here on the y-axis, you have, it's a logged y-axis, right? You have average population size, so the total population size of groups at these different levels of sociopolitical complexity on the x-axis. So from total autonomy on the left to sort of state level societies on the right. If you simply ask the question, is if I look at the average size of those populations, is there a consistent relationship between the complexity on the x and the size on the y? And it turns out, yes, indeed, there is this same kind of geometric series you see in hunter-gatherers, the same kind of exponential-like distribution. As I increase in one tier of socio-political complexity, on average, I will find that population consists of 4 times as many people. And if I do that again, it will, there'll be a fourfold increase, et cetera, et cetera. So as I increase, as I go through these socio-political transitions, the population size is increasing fourfold. I can then ask the same thing about geographic extent of these populations. And it's a little messier, but the trend is still there. So on average, hunter-gatherer populations, yes, they have smaller numbers, but they have very different subsistence bases, but they generally occupy smaller geographic ranges than larger scale complex systems, complex societies. And you will note that in these plots, you know, even the colored dots are averages, you know, there's a lot of variation, right? There's the whiskers there are 2 standard deviations. So there's a lot of variation. So you do find, so it isn't deterministic here, right? This is very much statistical and probabilistic. And I can just divide those two out and I can ask the same question of population density. So what you'll find is as you increase, as you go through a transition of increasing an additional layer of socio-political complexity, the population density is doubling each time, right? And so because it's doubling each time, that effect is quite important over those 5 different scales. So transitions in socio-political complexity in traditional human societies seem to have this very clear signature of increasing fourfold in size, doubling in spatial extent, so therefore doubling in population density. We can then also just show this with you know, data collapses. So these are just cumulative distribution functions. This is just the raw data. So on the x-axis, you have the probability or cumulative probability. Sorry, on the y-axis, on the x-axis, you have population size or area population density. The idea behind these is if truly all these distributions are simply separated by a branching ratio, you should be able to collapse all these distributions onto each other by simply controlling for the mean, right? And that's what you see in the data, which is really nice. So all these probability distributions collapse quite neatly onto each other, which actually suggests something interesting statistically, saying that it's not just the average properties of these social networks which are self-similar, but it means that all statistical moments of that distribution are self-similar, such that they all collapse onto each other. So the variances collapse, the kurtosis collapses, the skewness collapses, etc., which is great. So it means that the human social networks at these different scales are fundamentally the same thing. They're just rescaled by a constant factor. And the question is, you know, what is that constant factor? That constant factor is something about the additional benefits or the additional abilities the population receives from adding an additional tier of socio-political complexity or bureaucracy to the system. Now, as we have measures of area and independent measures of population size, then we can just play the game of scaling the two against each other. So we can now ask, at these different levels of socio-political complexity, how does the geographic range, for example, vary as a function of population size? And what you see here, these are these 5 different levels, and these are just straightforward scaling functions. These are power functions, so log axes. But what you'll observe here is, as you increase scales of socio-political complexity, the slopes of those relationships get steeper and steeper and steeper. So one way of interpreting that is by saying that the economies of scale, or the benefits that individuals are receiving, the spatial benefits that individuals are receiving, are actually decreasing in efficiency the more political social organization there is. We'll just talk about that in a second. That's what this plot here is showing. So on the left, on the y-axis, we have the slope. So the slope of those scaling functions. And on the x-axis, it's the scale of socio-political complexity. So the scale of that function is increasing, and it's increasing at a steady rate, right? It's increasing at about 7%. So it's getting steeper and steeper and closer to 1, essentially. At the same time, the intercept is decreasing. So the intercept of these scaling functions is the amount of area per individual. So in subsistence level societies, by definition, that is how much area an individual requires in order to meet their metabolic requirements, their energetic, their ecological requirements. That decreases with sociopolitical complexity, because as sociopolitical complexity is increasing, these are increasingly pastoralist or agriculturalist populations, which by definition adding capital labor into the landscape and increasing the return rates per unit area of that landscape. So obviously, if you're a hunter-gatherer, you need to access a hell of a lot more space than if you're an agriculturalist, right? And that's what this is capturing here. So then you can simply plot the slope as a function of the intercept. So what this means statistically, or sort of graphically actually, is that as populations are going through these transitions in socio-political complexity, you're doubling in population density, essentially. You're 4-fold increase in size, 2-fold increase in geographic range, but that density is being reconfigured. It's not the same density, right? The scaling relationship that's describing that density is getting steeper and steeper. So that means the overlap of individual home ranges or individuals in space is actually decreasing the more complex the system gets. But at the same time, the area per individual is decreasing and decreasing and decreasing. So hunter-gatherers, everybody's sharing the same amount of space, everybody's cooperating, everybody's overlapping, but the more complex the society becomes, the more separated in space individuals become. And so there are definitely payoffs to efficiency to the system, both, well, there are decreases in efficiency on some scales and increases in efficiency in other scales. So you're increasing the efficiency in the amount of energy you're getting per unit land in complex societies, but you're actually interacting, or you're relying on others less on that finest scale. So what all this means in terms of foraging societies and non-foraging societies is that, first of all, humans as hunter-gatherers, so the vast majority of our human evolutionary history, humans aggregate themselves in these complex social networks for all kinds of ecological and life history reasons. So for life history reasons, the ability of us to access resources on a landscape is behind very fundamental things like family formation, right? The fact that we have pair-bonded families where both parents invest in the survival of their offspring is rare. That's a human trait. Some other primates do that, but not very many others, right? But the fact is, once you have that configuration, you need to bind yourself to other families in order to make that process work. And so this leads to the aggregation of individual bands. At the same time, you need connections to other people for all kinds, for genetic reasons, for all kinds of social reasons, for technological reasons. Families are going to be dispersed in space, so you're going to be visiting, you're going to be aggregating. There's this fission-fusion dynamic. So what that means is this is, you know, you can then go into the literature of small world, modular, you know, statistically self-similar networks, and you'll see that, yes, these are remarkably robust. These are very remarkably common in living systems, so not just human systems. If you're going to form a network, a small scale tetrahedral network like this is a very common solution in life, right? Humans have just stumbled on that connection. So what it means is that if you are a primate of our body size, tasked with the job of going out into the landscape to get resources in order to fuel my dependents and keep my offspring alive as long as possible, I need to belong to a social network. I will form a social network that has this kind of property. And if we move up the scale to non-foraging societies, what you basically see is the same kind of thing just being reiterated at much larger scales. So now, as I would say choose, but as I increase in socio-political complexity by investing in more technology and start having more bureaucracy, you see the same kind of thing where you see that there's a transition to a higher, you know, the next level of socio-political complexity leads to a predictable change in scale of that system, which can be measured in the size, the extent, and the density of that system. But that density is also reconfiguring itself, right? So these are responses to these transitions. So this is very important when it comes to ideas of, you know, things like the social reactor or urban scaling theory, you know, urban science, which is this big thing nowadays, which I spent many years working with Louis Bettencourt at Santa Fe Institute while he was developing many of these ideas. And, you know, what this is kind of showing is that, you know, the phenomena that he's observing that's so rich in urban societies and now in other sort of in prehistoric urban societies too, is actually a fundamental feature of human systems all the way back as far as we can tell. So what seems to have been happening in human systems is we configure this way of forming social networks of a relatively limited scale in hunter-gatherer systems. And as we develop larger systems and more structure, we simply take that system, we just bolt on extra layers and extra layers and extra layers. And we see this throughout sociological literature, right? So if you look at the formation of companies or the formation of literature, academic institutes, for example, you'll see, yes, we aggregate most locally at a fine-grained scale with a small number of individuals that have weak connections to a larger system. We will call these, you know, departments in university, and then we belong to colleges and etc. You'll see the same thing in company dynamics. So there's something very intrinsic about the evolved human psychology that we receive the best benefits by working at a small scale, but then we get the magnification of aggregating those local benefits by connecting with other small modular units. And then we just keep doing that to the size of Facebook nowadays, right? So now we have social networks for the first time in Earth history where, you know, 2/3 of a species almost instantaneously connected to each other if they wish to be, if they just know a few bits of binary digit information about each other, and they can connect and share all kinds of information. So everybody knows by now, or at least there is, you know, strong evidence that things like the internet, the World Wide Web, all kinds of social media have this modular, self-similar structure to it. And yes, indeed, this is what humans have been doing for many, many thousands, if not millions of years. So with that, I'll end there and I'll happily take any questions you might have.
Thank you very much. Really nice talk, really clear. So I guess there are questions, you can put them in the chat or you can just raise your hand. I mean, is there anybody who can give the floor before I do it? I see, yeah. Meneer de Vries looks like it.
Yes, that's right. Thank you for this talk. I'm also from UU, but I still have my 149 code.
Yeah.
I have a question because in the past I worked with anthropologists and archaeologists, and they were using the concept after research in Africa, the concept of heterarchy, which basically means that you have, in fact, not a hierarchical structure, but they define it as each element possesses the potential of being unranked or ranked in a number of different ways. So my question is there a place for this notion of heterarchy in your work, in your approach?
So if I understand how they're using, if you're using the term, I would think it'd be fine. Yeah, so heterarchy, meaning, there's different ways of organizing those social relationships in a egalitarian system, so an uncontrolled, decentralized system. And so, yes, undoubtedly that's the case, right? Because essentially what this is all getting at is that there are fundamental statistical properties to this. So, the means and the variances and things are very well defined, but that doesn't mean that every observed anthropological society is going to show this behavior. We're showing this is the ensemble statistics of that population, right? So if you look at all that data together, this is the pattern you see, and that's the interesting observation. But they might very well be the case that if you go to an individual population anywhere on the planet, you might see a slightly different configuration of this kind of thing. So it's
not inconsistent with your approach of dynamic branching?
I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't think necessarily. I mean, you could interpret it maybe as being divergent from that, but I wouldn't think so. I mean, it is definitely the case. Anywhere you go on the planet, with any human society that you study, whether or not it's truly statistically self-similar, it is definitely modular and hierarchical in that those modules have some connections to other modules that have some connection to other modules, right? So that is undoubtedly the case. And then exactly the statistical configuration of that, that's where you can start.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Somebody else? Well, while you're thinking, I have a question. I mean, if you look at the sort of development in time, I mean, you would expect there to also been shocks and, revolutions. And so how does that, how does that affect this network formation in different levels?
Yeah, you see this all the time, actually. We had a paper about exactly this in the Royal Society a number of years ago, where, yes, so human development or the expansion of human systems over prehistory has not been this nice linear progression towards, whatever. In fact, it's this sawtooth pattern of, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes it's 1 step forward, 3 steps back, right? Because there's demographic collapses, there are all kinds of environmental things, there's warfare, there's competition, all of this stuff makes it messy. And so in some systems where you have data, and we can look at this phylogenetically, you can actually track what happens and it seems to be the case that yes, populations arrive on an island, the island gets more socially politically complex, something happens, it decreases. As it decreases in complexity, it loses a tier of hierarchy and all the associated other things happen with it. It's no longer producing agricultural products at the same rate that it was, for example. Autonomy is breaking down to a more local basis. So as the system gets perturbed, you see quite predictable results. So you see interesting things like in geopolitics nowadays with, if you have one government that goes in and intervenes by extracting the political infrastructure of that system, such as Iraq, what happens is it now relies on the pre-existing infrastructure, which is a more tribal infrastructure, and you get a very different kind of dynamic. Then all the politicians will scratch their heads and think, why could this possibly be the case? Well, because it's quite predictable as to what would happen, right?
But the data you analyze, I mean, do you assume then that sort of they're in equilibrium? I mean, they don't undergo a transition at this moment or in the past? I mean, how do you compare the data in that sense?
So these data are not time series data.
No,
right?
I know, but they assume that there's some, you know, that those societies have certain equilibrium properties at that time.
Oh yeah, so
yeah.
Yes, so you're assuming all those kind of things. So well, you don't even necessarily have to strictly assume. You're simply observing what's the pattern I see in my data, regardless of any theory. And so it could easily be the case that yes, I can observe, you know, one, you know, tier level 3 society on the planet, or some hunter-gatherer society that's going through a demographic collapse. And so I'll observe that they have a consistent family size, but maybe their bands are particularly small and their total metapopulation is much smaller on average. And so they'll be lower down in those whiskers. They won't be anywhere near the average. So undoubtedly, all that kind of thing is adding to the fact that there's a lot of variation. Yeah. And so when, so one of the implications of this kind of work is showing, you know, while we see these general relationships between the scale of a system and the political complexity of a system, it's not deterministic, right? It's just saying, you know, as you increase in population densities, you're more likely to observe a society that has an additional tier of organization, of bureaucracy, but it doesn't require it. And in fact, there's a lot of relatively simple subsistence societies that have tens of thousands of people dispersed over, you know, a wide geographic areas.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, let's see, Jaap Mont had a question.
Yeah, you would like me to do that verbally or just read it?
No, yeah, go ahead.
Well, the point is, you mentioned interaction and relations, but I feel that the interaction within small groups is of a different kind than those between groups, more so even if you look at it on a global scale. Like I'm doing on a global scale, have many interactions via email on the topic of geophysics, but it's a different kind of interaction than between me and my family or between me and my neighbors in the same city. So is that taken into account?
No, it isn't, and it's very important, right? So, I mean, it is taken into account implicitly. So implicitly, you're saying to be a functional human in these societies, I need to interact with my local group, and that interaction is getting me all kinds of benefits from sort of just local resources and energy, for example. But then I also have to have networks where I can exchange genes with marriage partners. I also need to have networks which I can rely on socially when in bad times. I need other places I can go to, other people I can rely on. So there's all kinds of other kinds of social information I'm getting from being part of this larger social system. But yeah, if I'm at a local level, I'm not going to be receiving large, you know, parts of animals, for example, from the other half of the social network. So there's all kinds of different currencies. And I think that's part of the explanation of why these societies, even in hunter-gatherer societies, quite simple societies, are multi-tiered, is because there's all kinds of important currencies that are flowing at different timescales and at different rates, which are, you know, vitally important.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Anyone else?
Yeah, if I may. First, thank you very much for the presentation. It was really interesting. There was so much information, but also so well presented. So I just want to say thank you for that. But then my main point is about also some temporal aspects, because I look at inequality during or as what the origin is the Neolithic revolution. And right now I'm abstracting away from all these structures, from all your levels. So I want to know how quickly, at those points where the Neolithic revolution happened originally, how quickly do you feel got these levels added over time? Is it defensible in my case to abstract away from them and say everyone is just very nuclear? Or should I think more critically about that and perhaps add some elements of these hierarchies to my model?
Yeah, well, you know, as I'm sure you're fully well aware, this is a big debate, right? I mean, it's, you know, so basically, is the Neolithic revolution a revolution, or is it something that happened gradually? And increasing archaeological evidence is saying, no, it's this kind of gradual process of things accumulating over time. In most places, it seems to, right? So I think, so it's interesting, right? So, you know, in this talk, there's a limited amount of time, but within hunter-gatherers, for example, there's a whole spectrum of diversity. So there are sedentary hunter-gatherers that are not running around the landscape in nomadic, you know, small groups. No, they're settled on the northwest coast of North America or next to the lake in the Baltics, and they're there for multiple generations. They're essentially harvesting the resources available to them. And there's a direct correlation between, if you're sedentary, then you do seem to develop these additional tiers of hierarchy, right? So you do find hunter-gatherer systems that have elites and they have networks in place which are institutionalized, right? And we're getting more indications in the archaeological record that there's more of that going on than we ever thought. And in fact, that's probably, in some places, that's probably the more common way of being a hunter-gatherer than a Hadza nomad, right? It's probably a rare circumstance. So when it comes to things like the agricultural transition or the Neolithic revolution, yeah, you might well have, you know, local hunter-gatherer populations, very good naturalists. There's already sort of increased knowledge building up in that system. And over several generations, you find yourself doing something that your grandparents weren't doing. And it's, you know, you're relying more on the resources you're tending yourself. So that's probably not a direct, you know, a revolutionary event, right? It's just a transition over some period of time. And then there's probably an emergent process that comes along with that, that as people start specializing in tasks, whereas in most hunter-gatherer groups, tasks are redundant. So males tend to do male things, females tend to do female things, and then there's age differences, but that's about it. All adults basically do the same things. But once people start specializing in different tasks and they're localized in space, then yeah, you probably need bureaucracies to sort of manage that kind of thing, infrastructure. So this long-winded answer is, I think the first Neolithic societies would have been remarkably similar to hunter-gatherer populations on the same landscapes at those times. And over time, you probably see this divergence starting to build up. But I doubt that it's a dramatic, instantaneous event.
So I can breathe easy a little bit about simplifying it.
I agree with you there.
Do you have a citation that I could use that kind of talks about this very on the point? Is there something, or?
I'd have to look. I mean, I can definitely point you to a bunch of resources.
I don't want you extra trouble, just off the top of your head. But anyway, thank you.
Look at there's the edited volume by Bruce Windsor-Halder on behavioral ecology and the agricultural transition. And then there's all kinds of references in there, so you can go from there. But this, you know, lots of people are talking about this nowadays.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
Anybody else?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So first of all, as well, thanks very much for the lecture. It was very interesting. As a system increases in population or population density, one can imagine there's conflict happening between groups, within groups. And I think it's kind of following up with Henk's question about the perturbations. In order to maintain a resilient system, is there any mechanisms in place to resolve conflict that are consistent throughout each scale, or do they change?
Yeah, I mean, that's what seems to be a large part of this bureaucracy. So in hunter-gatherer systems, at least in mobile hunter-gatherer systems, political tension does build up between individuals and families, right? But you have a dispersal mechanism. You just get up and leave. And ethnographically, this happens all the time. If you ask people, why did you move group? It's like, because I do not like those families. You know, they're cheaters, they're free riders, you know, I was paying the cost. So the problem is, you know, in things like the Neolithic transition, right? Once you start aggregating people on the landscape, how do you stop them killing each other or stealing each other's stuff? And that requires bureaucracy and policing. And there's a lot of game theory to understand, you know, punishment and the various costs of that and being able to monitor that. The archaeological response to this is often by having you know, an authority in place that makes a decision for you. That's a very simple decision. The other is you build infrastructure. I now store my things behind brick walls, which physically defend it. And I now have property rights to fields that are written down and that can be transferred. So now I have institutions that protect rights. And so all of this is a response exactly to increasing competition and what we call the coordination problems that occur as the system increases in complexity. And so I would just say, for example, like in the earliest city-states in the ancient Near East in southern Mesopotamia, you have agricultural populations that start developing bureaucracies. But one of the first things you see is people build city walls, and then they build armies to defend themselves. And then they work out very quickly that one of the best forms of defense is attack. So I'm going to beat up my neighbor before they beat me. Because if I don't do that, then they're going to do that to me. And so then it does lead to internation warfare between city-states. And then it requires empires or larger systems to quell that. And it leads to a sort of cycle of competition, right?
So how's the model development and these kind of interactions? I mean, is there any sort of more microscopic models describing this? Or is that not very developed?
Oh yeah, so underlying this, there's a whole field of behavioral economics and behavioral ecology, where ethnographers in very real terms are monitoring interactions, looking at economic exchanges. So a whole idea and measuring things in the life history, right? So what economic transfers are going on? How is that impacting reproductive fitness? How is that affecting how many kids people have? And then the distribution of people having kids in families. How does that affect survival rates? Because in natural fertility population, you know, infant survival can be very, very low, or infant mortality can be, you know, 30, 40, 50%, right? So there's a whole body of literature and work that's looking exactly at that kind of thing. And yeah, so this kind of work is now trying to aggregate that and saying, you know, at a larger scale, what do these underlying optimizations result in? What's the network you achieve out of this stuff after solving these local problems?
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Anyone else? Question for Marcus? I don't see anyone anymore. It's also already 5 o'clock now. So let me thank Marcus Hamilton again. It was a really interesting lecture, also very clear. So I enjoyed the subject also. It's interesting to think about.
Excellent.
And it's also a nice, application area of complex system science. So thank you very much again for being there. And then I'll close with mentioning that next week on Thursday we have Didier Sonnet from the ATH in Zurich. He's a real tornado, so it's an enormous amount of information we get next week, but it's not so clear and structured as today, I think. But let's see how.
So, can I just say, I've never worked with Didier Sonnet, but you know, a lot of his work dovetails directly with a lot of what I've been talking about, which is fascinating.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, he's of course done a lot of different applications. I know him because I worked with him in a project, and it was really exciting to sort of work with him. Okay, well, thank you very much for Marcus. Have a good rest of the day in sunny San Antonio, I see, and for the others, I hope to see you next week.
All right. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.